For 10 years, Dad called my job playing on a computer. Every holiday he'd laugh and say, "Get a real career." Last month he called me crying. He needed $80,000 for the house. I simply replied with 3 words. He hasn't called since. Hey everyone, my name's Eric, I'm 34, and I need to tell you a story about how 3 words changed everything between me and my father. 3 little words. That's it. And honestly, I didn't even plan to say them. They just came out. The way the truth tends to when you've been swallowing it for a decade. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because if you don't understand where this started, the ending won't hit the way it should. I grew up in a small town in Ohio called Ridgemont. Population hovering around 11,000. Give or take whoever moved to Columbus that year to escape the soul-crushing boredom. My dad, Gerald, was a contractor. Built houses, renovated kitchens, poured foundations. He was good at it too, I'll give him that. The man could frame a wall faster than most people can assemble IKEA furniture, and he wore that like a badge of honor every single day of his life. To him, real work meant your hands were calloused and your back hurt by 5 o'clock. If you weren't physically exhausted, you weren't really working. That was the gospel according to Gerald. My mom, Sheila, passed when I was 14. Ovarian cancer. Took her in 8 months. She was the buffer between my dad and the rest of the world, and when she left, that buffer went with her. Dad didn't get mean exactly, but he got hard. Like someone took whatever softness was left in him and just sanded it down to nothing. He threw himself into work, and he expected me and my older brother Coulter to do the same. Now Coulter, he was the golden child, 2 years older than me, built like a linebacker, and he followed Dad right into the trades. By 18, he was running a crew for Dad's company. By 22, he was Dad's right hand. They were like a 2-man propaganda machine for manual labor. Every dinner, every holiday, every phone call, it was about the jobs they landed, the houses they flipped, the money they were pulling in. And look, I respected it. I still do. Construction is hard, honest work, and I never once looked down on it. But it wasn't for me, and that's where the trouble started. I was always the weird one in the family. While Coulter was learning to operate a backhoe at 16, I was in my room teaching myself how to code. I found an old tutorial online for building websites when I was about 13, and something just clicked. It was like my brain had been waiting for this language, and suddenly I was fluent. I moved from HTML to Python, then JavaScript, then got into database architecture and back-end development. By the time I graduated high school, I'd already built 3 websites for local businesses, charging $200 a pop, which felt like a fortune to a 17-year-old kid in Ridgemont. Dad thought it was a phase. He literally said that. Sitting at the kitchen table my senior year, I told him I wanted to study computer science at Ohio State. He put down his fork, looked at me the way you'd look at a dog wearing a tiny hat, and said, "You'll grow out of it." Then he went back to eating his meatloaf like I hadn't spoken. I didn't grow out of it. I got into Ohio State, took out loans because Dad made it very clear he wasn't funding a degree in playing on a computer. His words. Those exact words would follow me for the next decade of my life like a shadow I couldn't shake. I worked part-time, kept freelancing, and graduated in 4 years with a degree in computer science and a minor in business. I was proud of that. I thought maybe, just maybe, Dad would be too. At my graduation dinner, which Dad almost didn't come to because Coulter had a big pour that weekend, I made the mistake of telling the family I'd gotten a junior developer position at a tech company in Columbus. Salary was $48,000 to start. Not life-changing money, but solid for a 22-year-old with 0 connections. Dad's response. He laughed. Not a chuckle. A full, belly-deep laugh. Then he looked at Coulter and said, $48,000 to sit in a chair all day. Coulter made that his first year with me, and he actually worked for it. Coulter, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He gave me a little nod across the table, like a silent apology he didn't have the guts to say out loud. That nod would become a recurring theme over the next 10 years. Coulter always knew Dad was being unfair. He just never once stepped in to say it. And so it began. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every random Sunday dinner I was guilted into attending, the routine was the same. Dad would ask me how work was going. I'd start to tell him about a project, a promotion, a new client. And before I could get 3 sentences in, he'd cut me off with some version of the same joke. Still playing on that computer, huh? Sometimes he'd add a little seasoning to it. When are you going to get a real career? Or my personal favorite, You know, they've got robots that can do that stuff now. What are you gonna do then? The table would go quiet. Coulter would stare at his plate. My Aunt Darla, who hosted most holidays after Mom passed, would try to change the subject. And I'd just sit there, smiling like an idiot, pretending it didn't feel like a knife in my ribs every single time. Here's the thing nobody tells you about parental dismissal. It doesn't hit you all at once. It's not one big, devastating blow. It's 1,000 tiny cuts over years and years until one day you realize you've been bleeding the whole time and you didn't even notice. Every time Dad laughed at my career, a little piece of my confidence chipped off. I started doubting myself. I'd get a raise, and instead of celebrating, I'd think, but is this a real job? I'd land a huge client, and instead of feeling proud, I'd hear Dad's voice in my head going, playing on a computer. It messed me up. I won't sugarcoat that. By 26, I was making $75,000 a year, had my own apartment, was building a reputation in my field, and I still felt like a failure. Because the one person whose approval I wanted most in the world treated my entire career like a punchline. The worst part? Dad wasn't even being malicious. I truly believe that. He wasn't trying to destroy me. He just genuinely could not comprehend that sitting at a desk and typing could be valuable work. In his mind, I was basically getting paid to play video games. And no amount of explaining was going to change that. I tried, believe me. I sat him down once and tried to walk him through what back-end development actually involved. His eyes glazed over in about 45 seconds, and he said, "Sounds complicated. But it's not real building though, is it?" I stopped trying to explain after that. Some walls you just can't code your way through. Trust me, I would know. The holidays became a minefield. Every year I'd tell myself it would be different, and every year it wasn't. Thanksgiving 2020 was a particular gem. I'd just been recruited by a bigger firm in Columbus, bumped up to $65,000 with benefits that would make your head spin. I was excited, genuinely excited. I walked into Aunt Darla's house with a bottle of wine and what I thought was good news. Dad was already 3 beers deep, leaning against the kitchen counter, holding court about a deck he'd just built for someone on the city council. I waited for a lull, mentioned the new job, and he turned to Aunt Darla and said, "Hear that, Darla? Eric's upgrading his video game chair." Coulter coughed into his napkin. Aunt Darla poured herself more wine. And I stood there, smiling, always smiling, because what else was I going to do? Cause a scene at Thanksgiving? Over a joke that was supposedly just a joke? But here's the thing about jokes. Real jokes are funny for everyone. When only one person is laughing and the other person is bleeding, that's not a joke. That's target practice. And I was Dad's favorite target for a very long time. The pattern continued for years. Every milestone I hit, every promotion I earned, every skill I developed, it all got reduced to the same punchline. Playing on a computer. And I took it. Year after year after year, I just took it because I loved my dad and I wanted him to love what I was becoming. That's all I ever wanted. For him to look at me the way he looked at Coulter and say, "I'm proud of you, son." He never did. Not once. Not in 10 years. And what's wild is, I kept showing up anyway. Kept putting myself in the firing line. Kept hoping that this time, this holiday, this phone call, something would be different. It wasn't. Until it was. But we'll get to that. The years kept rolling, and so did the jokes. They became this grotesque family tradition, like a Thanksgiving turkey nobody wanted, but everyone expected. I turned 27, 28, 29. Each year my career grew. Each year Dad's respect for it didn't. When I was 28, I got promoted to senior developer at my company. I was leading a team of 6 people and managing projects worth $500,000. I called Dad to tell him, because despite everything, I still wanted him to care. He listened for maybe 30 seconds, then said, "That's nice, bud. Hey, did I tell you Coulter just landed the contract for the new fire station? 3,200 square feet. The whole town's talking about it." I sat on the edge of my bed after that call, staring at the wall, wondering why I kept doing this to myself. It was like touching a hot stove over and over and being surprised every time it burned. Then came the Christmas when I was 29. This is the one that broke something in me. Something that needed to break, honestly, but it didn't feel that way at the time. I brought my girlfriend to dinner. Waverly. We'd been dating about 8 months, and she was the first person I'd been with who actually understood what I did for a living and thought it was impressive. She was a graphic designer, creative as heck, and she had this way of making me feel like my work mattered. I was nervous about introducing her to the family, but also a little excited. Maybe having someone there who respected my career would change the dynamic. Maybe Dad would see me through her eyes for once. We got to Aunt Darla's house around 4. Coulter was already there with his wife Lila and their 2 kids. Dad was in the living room holding court, telling everyone about some renovation he'd done for a local dentist. Classic Gerald. We walked in. I introduced Waverly. Everyone was polite. So far so good. Then we sat down for dinner, and it started. Dad asked what Waverly did for work. She told him she was a graphic designer. He nodded, which was more acknowledgement than he'd ever given my career, and said, "So you do the artsy computer stuff too, huh? You two must have a real exciting time staring at screens together." Waverly laughed it off, thinking he was being playful. I knew better. I could feel the machinery warming up. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, Coulter mentioned he was thinking about expanding the business, maybe hiring 2 more guys for the new year. Dad lit up like a Christmas tree. He went on for 15 minutes about how proud he was, how Coulter was building a legacy, how the family name meant something in Ridgemont because of their work. "Real work," he said, twice. Then he turned to me and said, "So Eric, you still doing the computer thing? Or have you finally come to your senses?" The table went quiet. Aunt Darla looked at her wine glass like she was considering drowning in it. Coulter did his trademark plate stare. I said, "I just got promoted, Dad. I'm managing a team now." He waved his hand like he was swatting a fly. "Managing a team of what? Other kids on computers? Come on, son. When are you going to do something with your hands? Something that actually matters." Waverly's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She looked at me, then at Dad, then back at me. I could see her processing what she was witnessing in real time. I said quietly, "My work matters, Dad." He leaned back in his chair and chuckled. "I'm just busting your chops, Eric. Don't be so sensitive. That's always been your problem. Too sensitive." Coulter never had that issue. And there it was. The comparison. Always the comparison. I wasn't just being dismissed. I was being measured against Coulter and found lacking. Not because of anything real, but because my work didn't make Dad's hands dirty. Waverly excused herself to the bathroom. When she came back, I could tell she'd been crying, which confused me because I was the one being humiliated. Later she told me she cried because watching someone she loved get torn down by their own father and just sit there and take it was one of the most heartbreaking things she'd ever seen. That hit me harder than anything Dad had ever said. The car ride home was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then Waverly said something that changed my life. She said, "Eric, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think before you answer. Why do you keep going back?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because I didn't have an answer. Not a good one. Not one that made any sense. She said, "You are brilliant. You are talented. You are building something incredible with your career. And every time you go to that table, you let him take a little piece of that away from you." "What?" I said, "He's my dad." She said, "That's not a reason. That's an excuse. I don't know if you've ever had someone hold up a mirror and show you something about yourself that you've been hiding from, but it feels like getting hit by a truck made of truth." I couldn't breathe for a second, because she was right. I'd been letting Dad chip away at me for years, and I'd been justifying it with 2 words. "He's my dad." As if sharing DNA was a permission slip for someone to make you feel small. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Dad. I wasn't going to make a scene or cut him off or write some dramatic letter. I was just going to stop caring. I was going to build my life so big and so solid that his opinion couldn't touch it anymore. I was going to become undeniable. Not for him. For me. I wish I could tell you the transition was smooth. It wasn't. The next year was rough. I pulled back from family events, which Dad didn't even notice at first, because let's be honest, I was never the one he was paying attention to anyway. But Coulter noticed. He called me a few times, said Dad was asking why I didn't come to Easter dinner. I told Coulter I was busy with work. He said, "Dad thinks you're sulking." I said, "Dad can think whatever he wants." That was a new sentence for me. It tasted like freedom. Meanwhile at work, something was shifting. I've been doing freelance projects on the side for years, mostly small stuff. But around this time, I landed a contract with a mid-sized logistics company that needed a complete overhaul of their inventory management system. It was a big job, way bigger than anything I'd tackled solo. But I took it on and I delivered. The system I built saved them an estimated $200,000 in the first year just from efficiency improvements. Word got around. In the tech world, especially in the mid-market space I was working in, reputation is everything. One satisfied client tells another, who tells another, and suddenly your phone is ringing more than it's not. By the time I turned 30, I had a real decision to make. Stay at my salaried job where I was comfortable and respected, or take the leap and go out on my own. Waverly, who by then was my fiancée, looked at me across our tiny kitchen table and said, "You've been ready for this for 2 years. The only person who doesn't know that is you." So I jumped, and for the first 3 months, I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Going out on your own sounds glamorous until you're sitting alone in a home office at 2 in the morning, eating cold pizza over your keyboard, wondering if you just torpedoed your entire financial future because you wanted to prove something to a man who never asked you to. Those first 3 months were brutal. My first 2 prospective clients fell through. One got acquired by a bigger company and froze all new projects. The other just ghosted me, straight up vanished. I sent 4 follow-up emails that got swallowed into the void. I started to wonder if the void was where my career was headed to. Waverly kept her design work going, which kept us afloat, but I could see the stress in her face even when she tried to hide it. She never once said, "I told you so," or suggested I go back to my old job. She just kept saying, "Give it time." I didn't deserve that level of patience, but I was grateful for it every single day. The low point came about 2.5 months in. I was checking my bank account, doing the math on how long we could survive if nothing came through, and my phone rang. It was Coulter. He said Dad was having a barbecue for his 60th birthday and wanted to know if I was coming. I almost said no. Almost. But some combination of guilt and obligation and that stupid little kid inside me who still wanted his dad to be proud made me say yes. Biggest mistake I'd made since the time I tried to install Linux on a toaster as a college dare. Don't ask. The barbecue was at Dad's house. Same house I grew up in. Same peeling paint on the porch he always said he'd fix, but never did. Ironic for a contractor, but that's Dad. The cobbler's kids have no shoes and the contractor's house has no functioning gutters. I walked in and it was the usual crowd. Coulter and Lila, their kids running around like tiny beautiful tornadoes. Aunt Darla, a few of Dad's work buddies, and Dad himself, standing by the grill with a beer in his hand and that look on his face like he owned the whole town. Which, to be fair, he kind of did own a few of the buildings. Waverly was with me. She squeezed my hand before we walked in, which was her way of saying, "I've got you. But also, why are we here?" Within 20 minutes, Dad found his opening. One of his work buddies, a guy named Hank who had a face like a sunburned walrus, asked me what I did. Before I could answer, Dad jumped in. "Eric here plays on his computer for a living. Isn't that right, son?" Then he laughed, and Hank laughed, and I stood there holding a paper plate of potato salad wondering at what point it became acceptable to humiliate your own child as party entertainment. But this time, something was different. I didn't shrink. I didn't laugh along. I just looked at Dad and said, "I run my own software development company, actually." Dad raised his eyebrows. "Oh, a company now, is it? How's that going? Making any money yet?" The truth was, at that exact moment, I was barely breaking even. But I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I'm building something. It takes time." He snorted. "Building something? With code? Son, I've been building things my whole life. Real things. Things you can touch. Things that keep people dry when it rains. What you do is just..." He waved his hand in the air. "Invisible." I put down my plate. Waverly's hand found my back. I said, very calmly, "I think we're going to head out, Dad. Happy birthday." He called after me as I walked out. "Oh, come on, Eric. Don't be dramatic. I'm just playing around." I didn't turn back. Waverly and I drove home in silence, but it wasn't a sad silence. It was a resolved one, like we'd both agreed on something without having to say it. I was done auditioning for a role I was never going to get. That night I sat down at my desk, and I worked until sunrise. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. Because for the first time, my motivation wasn't proving Dad wrong. It was proving myself right. And then the universe apparently decided I'd suffered enough, because things started clicking. A former colleague named Deacon, brilliant guy, great with cloud infrastructure, reached out and said he'd heard I went independent. He wanted to partner on a project for a healthcare startup that needed a custom patient management system. The contract was worth $120,000. We split it 60-40 since I was doing the bulk of the architecture work. We delivered early. The client was thrilled. They referred us to another healthcare company, then another. Within 6 months, I went from eating cold pizza in the dark to running a legitimate operation. I brought Deacon on full-time, then hired a front-end developer named Sloan who could make an interface look like it was designed by angels with engineering degrees. The three of us were a machine. By the time I turned 31, my company was pulling in just over $400,000 in annual revenue. Not all profit, obviously, but I was personally clearing around $160 after expenses and salaries. More money than I'd ever imagined making. More money than Dad and Coulter's construction company made in a good year, though I didn't know that at the time. Waverly and I got married that fall. Small ceremony, 30 people, in a botanical garden outside Columbus. I didn't invite Dad. I told Coulter, and Coulter said he understood, which surprised me. He said, "I know he's hard on you, Eric. I've told him to lay off. He doesn't listen." I appreciated Coulter saying that, even if it was about 8 years too late. Life was good. Business was growing. I was signing contracts with companies I would have been starstruck by 2 years earlier. We bought a house, not a mansion, but a real honest-to-goodness house with a yard and a garage and a front door that didn't stick when it rained. Every time I walked through that door, I thought about all the doors Dad said I'd never be able to open. I also started putting money away. Serious money. Waverly and I lived below our means on purpose. We drove reasonable cars, didn't take extravagant vacations, and stacked savings like we were expecting the apocalypse. Part of that was just good sense. Part of it was growing up watching Dad spend every dollar the second it hit his account and never having a safety net. I promised myself I'd never live that way. By 32, I had just over $200,000 in savings. The business was growing about 30% year over year. I hired 2 more developers and a project manager named Sullivan who could wrangle clients like a rodeo champion. We moved into a real office space. I remember standing in that empty office the day before we moved in, looking at the bare walls and thinking, this is real. This is mine. And nobody can wave their hand and make it invisible. I found out later that during this whole period, Dad's business was going the other direction. The housing market in Ridgemont had cooled off. A couple of big projects fell through. Coulter told me, carefully, that Dad had taken on some debt to keep things going. Borrowed against the house. Made some bets that didn't pay off. But Dad never called me. Never mentioned it. His pride was a fortress that not even financial ruin could breach. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that. I didn't feel good about Dad struggling. Despite everything, he was still my father, and I loved him in that complicated, bruised way you love someone who's hurt you so many times you've lost count, but you can't quite let go. I just kept my head down and kept building. Because that's what you do when you're playing on a computer for a living. You build things nobody can see until suddenly they're everywhere. The call from Coulter came on a Tuesday in October. I remember because I was in the middle of reviewing a contract for a new client, a logistics firm out of Pittsburgh that wanted us to rebuild their entire supply chain tracking platform. It was the biggest deal we'd ever been offered. $750,000 over 18 months. My hands were literally shaking when I read the proposal. And then my phone rang and Coulter's name popped up and I knew, the way you just know sometimes, that whatever he was about to say was going to be heavy. "Hey," he said. His voice had that careful, measured tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news and they're testing whether you're sitting down. "Hey, what's going on?" "It's Dad." 2 words. My stomach dropped. For a second I thought he was going to tell me Dad was sick, or hurt, or worse. But it wasn't that. It was almost harder to hear, in a way. Coulter laid it out for me. Dad's business had been hemorrhaging money for the better part of 2 years. The slowdown in Ridgemont's housing market was worse than anyone had let on. Dad had taken on 2 big renovation projects that both went sideways. One client sued him for delays. The other ran out of money halfway through and left Dad holding the bag for materials he'd already bought on credit. He'd borrowed against the house to cover the gaps, and then borrowed some more. The interest piled up. The payments ballooned. Bottom line, Dad was about $80,000 in debt. The bank was threatening foreclosure on the house, and he had about 60 days to come up with the money or lose the home he'd lived in for 35 years. The home where Mom's garden used to bloom every spring. The home where Coulter and I grew up. The home Dad had sworn, on Mom's grave, that he'd never let go of. I was quiet for a long time. Coulter didn't rush me. Finally I said, "Where does he stand with the business?" Coulter exhaled. "It's done, Eric. He's been winding it down for months. He didn't tell me either, not until it was too late for me to do anything. I've got my own crew now, my own contracts, but I'm not sitting on that kind of cash. Lila and I just renovated our own place. We're tapped out, and Dad asked you to call me. There was a pause. Yeah, he couldn't call me himself. Another pause. You know how he is. I didn't know. That was the problem. I knew exactly how he was. He was a man who would rather lose his house than pick up the phone and admit to his younger son that the kid who played on computers was the only one who could save him. His pride wasn't just a fortress. It was a prison, and he'd locked himself inside. I told Coulter I needed some time to think. He said he understood. We hung up. I sat at my desk for probably 20 minutes, not moving, just staring at the Pittsburgh contract on my screen. $750,000 on one side of my life, $80,000 on the other, and a decade of being laughed at sitting right in the middle. That night, I told Waverly everything. She listened the way she always does, which is to say completely and without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I honestly don't know." She said, "Yes, you do. You just don't want to admit it yet because you're afraid of what it says about you either way." She was right, obviously. She's annoyingly right about most things, which is both the best and worst quality in a spouse. The truth was, part of me wanted to help. That was the kid in me, the one who still remembered Dad teaching him to ride a bike, who still remembered Dad sitting in the hospital waiting room when I broke my arm at 11, who still remembered the way Dad used to look at Mom like she was the only person in the world. That version of Dad existed once. He got buried under grief and stubbornness and years of not knowing how to connect with a son who was different from him. But he existed. And part of me, the part that had been dismissed and belittled and laughed at for 10 years, wanted to let him figure it out himself. Let him see what it feels like when the thing you've been leaning on your whole life crumbles and nobody's there to catch you. The same way I felt every time he waved away my accomplishments like they were nothing. I sat with it for 3 days. Didn't call Coulter back. Didn't call Dad. Just went to work, came home, kissed my wife, and carried this weight around like a boulder in my chest. On the third day, Waverly sat me down and said something that reframed everything. She said, "Eric, this isn't really about the money. You have the money. This is about the fact that your father has never once acknowledged what you've built, and now he needs the thing he's been mocking to save him. The question isn't whether you can afford to help. It's whether he can afford to keep pretending." And just like that, I knew what I was going to do. I didn't call Coulter. I called Dad directly. It was the first time I'd dialed his number in over a year. It rang 4 times, and I almost hung up, but then he picked up. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Tired. Like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for too long and had finally run out of strength. "Eric." "Hey, Dad." Silence. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the TV on in the background, some game show. I pictured him in his recliner, the same one he'd had since I was in high school, in that living room with the crooked bookshelf he never fixed because he was always fixing other people's houses instead. "Coulter told me," I said, "about the house." More silence. Then, very quietly, "I didn't ask him to call you." "Yeah, you did, Dad." He didn't argue. That told me everything. Gerald, the man who argued about everything from politics to the proper way to grill a steak, had nothing to say. The fight was out of him. Then he said it. The thing I'd waited 10 years to hear, and also the thing I never wanted to hear because of the circumstances surrounding it. He said, "I need help, Eric. I need about $80,000, or I'm going to lose the house. I know I don't have any right to ask you. I know I've been." He trailed off. "You've been what, Dad?" I wasn't being cruel. I needed to hear him say it. After a decade of ridicule, I needed the words. But he couldn't do it. Couldn't name it. Couldn't say, "I've been dismissive," or "I've been unfair," or "I've been wrong." Instead, he said, "I've been hard on you." I know that. Hard on me. Like he'd been a demanding coach instead of a father who mocked his son's entire life's work for laughs at the dinner table. Hard on me. I almost laughed. Instead, I gripped the phone so tight my knuckles went white, and I took a breath. And then I said the 3 words that had been living in my chest for years, patiently waiting for their moment. I said, "Get a real career." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. I want to tell you that I felt powerful in that moment, that some wave of satisfaction washed over me. But I'd be lying. After I said those 3 words, I felt like I was going to throw up. My hands were trembling, because saying that to your father, even a father who earned it, goes against every instinct you have. Even as a grown man, some part of you is still 7 years old, looking up at your dad like he's the biggest person in the world. Dad didn't say anything for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, "I see." 2 words. Flat. Empty. And then he hung up. I put the phone down and just sat there. Waverly came into the room, took one look at my face, and sat down next to me without saying a word. She just put her hand on my arm and stayed there. For 2 days, I heard nothing. No call from Dad. No call from Coulter. Radio silence from Ridgemont. I went to work, signed the Pittsburgh contract, which should have been the happiest moment of my professional life, and barely felt anything. Because revenge doesn't taste the way you think it will. It tastes like ashes and the terrible knowledge that you just hurt someone who hurt you. And now there are 2 wounded people instead of 1. On the 3rd day, Coulter called. He was quiet at first, then said, "Dad told me what you said." Yeah. He's been sitting in his chair for 2 days. Won't eat. Won't talk to anyone. He just sits there. My throat tightened. I know it sounds harsh, Coulter, but he said that exact thing to me every holiday for 10 years. Every single one. While I was building a career. While I was building a company. While I was building a life. He laughed at all of it. And now the only reason he called is because he needs the thing he laughed at to save him. Coulter was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're right. I know you're right. I should have said something a long time ago. I should have told him to stop. I didn't, and that's on me." That was the first time Coulter had ever taken responsibility for his role in the dynamic. 8 years of plate staring and silent nods, and he finally owned it. I won't pretend it fixed everything, but it meant something. It meant a lot, actually. I said, "I'm not going to let him lose the house, Coulter." He paused. "What?" I said, "I'm not going to let him lose Mom's house. But I'm not just writing a check either. If he wants my help, there are conditions, and he's going to hear them from me. In person." I drove to Ridgemont that Saturday. 3 hours on the highway with nothing but my thoughts and a podcast about medieval bread making that Waverly had queued up because she said I needed something calming. She wasn't wrong. There's something deeply soothing about learning how 13th century monks made sourdough. I pulled up to Dad's house around noon. The place looked tired. Paint peeling worse than I remembered. The gutters hanging on by stubbornness alone. The garden where Mom used to grow tomatoes was just dirt now. I sat in the car for a few minutes, then walked up those porch steps and knocked. Dad opened it. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 2 weeks. His eyes were red. His shoulders, which had always been squared up like he was ready to fight the world, were slumped. He looked at me, and I could see him trying to find his voice, trying to locate that swagger, that dismissiveness, that armor he'd worn for so long. It wasn't there. It had finally cracked. "Can I come in?" I said. He stepped aside without a word. I walked into the living room. Same furniture. Same crooked bookshelf. Same recliner. I sat on the couch, and he sat in his chair, and we looked at each other across that small room like 2 people standing on opposite sides of a canyon. I spoke first. "Dad, I'm going to help you with the house. I have the money, and I'm going to make sure you don't lose it. But first, I need you to hear some things, and I need you to actually hear them. Not dismiss them. Not wave your hand. Not change the subject to what Coulter's building." He nodded. Just a small nod. But it was the most he'd ever given me. I said, "For 10 years, you treated my career like a joke. Every holiday, every phone call, every time I tried to share something I was proud of, you laughed at it. You called it playing on a computer. You told me to get a real career. You compared me to Coulter like I was the defective version. And Dad, it crushed me. I don't care how tough you think I should be or how sensitive you think I am. It crushed me. Your opinion mattered to me more than anyone's in the world, and you used it to make me feel small." His jaw tightened. I could see him fighting every instinct to deflect, to minimize, to make a joke. But he didn't. He just sat there and took it, maybe for the first time in his life. I kept going. "The company I built, the one you thought was invisible, is the reason I can write you a check for $80,000 right now. The skills you laughed at pay my mortgage, employ 8 people, and just landed a contract worth $750,000. I built that, with a computer, and it's as real as anything you've ever framed or poured or hammered." There were tears on his face. Gerald, the man who hadn't cried since Mom's funeral, had tears running down his cheeks, and he wasn't even trying to hide them. He said, voice cracking, I know it is. I've known for a while. I just didn't know how to say it. You could have just stopped making the jokes, Dad. That would have been enough." He broke then. Really broke. He put his face in his hands and his shoulders shook and he said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Eric. I was scared. I didn't understand what you were doing, and instead of trying to learn, I made fun of it because that was easier than admitting my own son was smarter than me. That's the truth. I was threatened by you, by what you could do, because I couldn't understand it, and a man who can't understand something, well, in my mind that made me less than. And I couldn't be less than. So I made you less than instead. I won't pretend that confession made everything okay. It didn't. You don't erase 10 years of damage with one honest moment in a living room. But it was a start. The first real, honest thing he'd ever said to me about our relationship. I wrote him the check that afternoon. $80,000. He held it in his hands like it was made of glass. Then he looked at me and said, "Your mother would be so proud of you." That one got me. I'm not going to lie. I had to look away for a second because that living room was getting blurry and I refused to have a full breakdown in the same recliner where I used to watch cartoons. Here's where things stand now. That was about 4 months ago. Dad saved the house. He's retired from construction, which was probably overdue, given his knees sound like a popcorn machine every time he stands up. Coulter and I are closer than we've ever been. He calls every couple of weeks now. Not about Dad, not about drama, just to talk, like brothers should. Dad and I are in what I'd call the reconstruction phase. We talk on the phone about once a week. The conversations are short and a little awkward, like two people learning a new language together. He asks about my work now. Really asks. Last week he said, "That Pittsburgh thing, is that the big one? How's it going?" And I nearly fell out of my chair because Gerald had never once retained a single detail about my career. He hasn't called me since that day on the phone, by the way. They get a real career day. He's called since the visit, since the check, since the conversation. But that particular version of our relationship, the one where he calls to mock and I answer to absorb it, that's dead. And good riddance. Waverly says I should be proud of how I handled it. Not the 3 words on the phone, which she thinks were justified but also maybe a little savage. Her word, not mine. But proud of going back. Proud of not letting bitterness win. I don't know if I'm proud exactly, but I'm at peace. I have a wife who sees me, a company that's thriving, a brother who finally showed up, and a father who's trying, late as heck, to be the dad I deserved all along. My mom's house still stands on that street in Ridgemont with its peeling paint and crooked bookshelf. And somewhere inside it, a 61-year-old man is learning, for the first time, that the things you can't see with your eyes, the code, the logic, the invisible architecture that holds the digital world together, are just as real as concrete and steel. Maybe more real, because you can tear down a building, but you can't tear down someone who refused to stop building, no matter how many times you told them what they were making wasn't real. My name is Eric. I'm 34. I play on computers for a living. And business is very, very good.